Okay, Jean, super excited for this conversation. Thank you for joining me today. So pricing's always been one of the most powerful levers in retail, but today it's also one of the riskiest. Between AI, dynamic pricing, and regulation lagging behind innovation, and rising consumer scrutiny, pricing now sits at the fault line between both opportunity and exposure. So Jean Zelek is Senior Counsel at Taft Stettinius Hollister, and one of the most respected voices in pricing, law, and strategy. Gene is actually a rare blend of lawyer and business and commercial leader. So he's known for helping brands design pricing systems and channel frameworks that actually work in the real world, balancing commercial ambition with ethical and legal guardrails. So, Gene, you have an interesting background because you're also a former product manager turned marketing law expert. So you really have the context under your belt. And you're also a longtime faculty member at Kellogg Northwestern. So you're widely recognized by peers as one of the foremost pricing and distribution law experts in North America. And you're not just interpreting the law, but you're really helping brands and retailers turn this into commercial practice and outcomes. So I'm super excited to dive into this conversation with you. We're going to talk about how executives can navigate this rapidly shifting landscape. Before we jump into the conversation, is there anything else that you'd like to add to your background and experience? Because it is a particularly unique nexus that you sit in.
Well, you did a great job in describing things and made me sound really good and really smart. And I appreciate that because I need all the help I can get. It is kind of a unique position. And I think what I try to do is bring perspective. Is sometimes people just think of me as a lawyer, just talk about the law. And if you're really doing your job, it's a combination not only of the law, and my job is to provide sort of tools and help people get where they want to go, but also providing the perspective of standing back and saying what's really going on here and asking some of the hard questions. Business people are sort of laser focused and they're not thinking about the larger implications of what they're doing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but just to understand the big picture and what's going on. And sometimes those of us on the outside can bring that perspective. And also, if we have good relationships, we're not afraid to call things as we see them. And that's what I try to do.
Absolutely. So with your advisory around pricing specifically, pricing is something that is so sensitive in any context and here in brands and retail. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's so sensitive, and how do you help companies balance this with commercial flexibility and maintaining compliance within these legal guidelines?
Well, I think one of the things is pricing is obviously very powerful. And needless to say, pricing changes can immediately affect the bottom line, all other things being equal. So it's very powerful. It's not only has an economic consequence, but it has, there's all kinds of perceptions around it in terms of if I have a premium or a product that I want to be perceived as premium, I usually price it as a premium product, and all kinds of other things surround it. But the other thing that surrounds it is there are a lot of myths, particularly in the law, because it's sensitive from a legal point of view in many places. And so my experience has been a lot of business people think that they're more constrained than they are under the law. And so my job is to try to show them where there's the flexibility and where they can move in certain directions. So getting back to your question, it's powerful. That's why it gets a lot of emphasis. It's sensitive. That's another reason why it gets a lot of emphasis. And there's certain myths surrounding it that tend to constrain behavior. I can't tell you how many times I've heard business people describe what they think they can do from a legal point of view, and it's usually much narrower than what they really can do. And that's where I come in.
Makes sense. They're playing it safe. And I think in the context of branded retail and consumer goods too, you have that extra element of consumer shopper perception and risk related to that relative to, say, commodity products or other business to business products where there may not be the same severity of brand reputational risk that plays into it.
Right. I think from B2B context, it's often just business, or at least that's what you hear. It's just business, and that's what we're doing. There's always some emotion that enters into it, but I agree with you. In the consumer products area, particularly with respect to certain products, people really get involved on a personal level level. Buying cars, for example, there's usually a lot of personal involvement. Houses, another kind of thing. It's very, very personal. And in fact, if you treat it as just a business transaction, it's often off-putting to the seller because the seller wants you to be emotionally involved.
So we have this shifting landscape that we're all navigating, and we see regulation in certain contexts lagging behind the pace of innovation. How do you see companies proactively protecting themselves when the law is maybe gray or unsettled in some of these areas?
Well, I think that some of the principles, first, you stick to the principles that are established because it's impossible to get out a crystal ball and imagine where things are going to go. I mean, you kind of can, but who knows with any specificity. I think you touched on this earlier. One of the keys is to maintain flexibility. So you kind of think where things are going to go, and you want to make sure that you're not locked in. That you can be nimble, or as nimble as it will let you. And then one of the other things, and I'll come back to this later, I was thinking about some of the things you and I talked about earlier, and a lot of it has the same theme about flexibility, but then there's something else too that we see sometimes. I think it's important to maintain an exit strategy. Sometimes businesses really lock themselves in. Things change and they're stuck. We lawyers are often accused of focusing on the negatives, all the things that can go wrong and whatever. And I mean, how many times have I discussing risks with a client and they'll say, wait a minute, you're talking about a divorce before we even get married. Precisely. Now's the right time to do it when everybody loves everybody. Talk about an exit strategy so you have a way to get out if things don't work out as you plan. But I think there's something else too, and that is having a good sense of how much of what the risk tolerance is for a company. I mean, some companies are very much pedal to the metal. Others are extraordinarily conservative. And sometimes you get the clash of cultures too. A lot of the pricing flexibility we have in the United States is not present in Europe, for example. So when you have a European parent with a large US business, they try to apply some of the European standards. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's very conservative typically, but they're leaving money on the table in the United States. So we try to encourage a regional perspective. And I spent a lot of time persuading people in Europe and Asia, it's okay to do certain things in the US that you can't do there.
Makes sense. So it's really specific to the jurisdiction and the geography that you're operating in. And what you're saying is really taking the perspective of almost like maximizing your optionality. So trying to think through multiple scenarios in advance and how those could play out and planning your strategy in light of that. Moving into sort of pricing policies and brand reputation. So pricing policy, it's enforcement's no longer just about contracts. It's also about protecting brand equity, as we've mentioned, especially in this consumer context. So in your opinion, why is pricing policy harder to enforce in an omni-channel context? And how does reputational risk factor into any guidance you provide?
So let's first define some terms. By pricing policies, what I tend to think them as is setting minimum advertised prices or minimum resale prices, both of which are lawful in the United States and in Canada for that matter, and even in Mexico if done right, but generally not doable in other parts of the world. So we do a lot of work in that area for a variety of reasons. It's a big no-no in Europe. You can't go near it by and large. So I suppose in a sense, if you're going to set minimum prices, and we can get into the logic of that if you'd like, but if you're going to set minimum prices, part of it is enforcing them, enforcing your policies and taking action against people that don't comply. And usually the penalties are of a financial nature or cutting off product access or both. In the omnichannel environment, things move so fast that staying on top of them is often difficult, but there are very, very good monitoring services that will watch prices for you, monitoring several times a day. In fact, even every hour if you want, or more frequently. So that helps. But then there's also a horsepower race because there are some retailers that don't like their data being scraped, which is the way these monitoring services operate. And so they will erect barriers, and then the monitoring services have to figure out ways around it. So it's like a constant horsepower sort of race. So that makes it a little bit more difficult, but by and large, at least now, and this may change a great deal as we get into pricing driven by things like Chat GPT, but right now prices are pretty visible. by and large. And so that allows us to sort of data scraping and gathering this kind of evidence and whatever that may change. But again, it's always evolving, and it's always trying to stay on top of what's happening. I might hear from, and I work with a number of monitoring services, that not only is this constant sort of horsepower race, but they'll talk about how some of their competitors are shut out of looking at certain data because they've been effectively walled off, and they've got to figure out a way around that. Otherwise, they're not providing the complete data to their customers.
Yes, it's an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, you see brands and retailers trying to maximize the amount of competitive data that they can get access to make better decisions around multiple factors, not just pricing, but assortment and manufacturing decisions. But at the same time, it's also the incentive is there to try and wall off your own data so that your other competitors cannot get access to it. So I understand what you're saying in terms of this sort of horse race analogy. One point that you mentioned that I just want to dive into now. So particularly in these emerging agentic commerce frameworks, pricing may not even be visible to consumers or manufacturers. So, for example, if a digital agent is taking a shopper's request to find me, a silk dress in a certain color and a certain size with same-day delivery, and the agent's negotiating across platforms for pricing, delivery, whatever it may be, what do you think that invisibility means for regulation, for contracts, and reputational control?
It being more opaque will obviously make it more difficult to get data. There may be some workarounds because, again, we've seen in other areas constantly this sort of race to wall things off and then find a way to break down the wall. One thought, and I was discussing this with the CEO of a monitoring service, is he thinks that there may be some kind of validation operation because this could be like the Wild West. Consumers, they know if they go to Nordstrom.com or whatever, they know about Nordstrom. Nordstrom's going to get them their product. They're dependable and whatever. But if you have an intelligent bot that tells you to buy from XYZ and you've never heard of it, there may be a movement towards having some kind of verification intermediary. And it may be at the verification level where you can get access to that and see what the transaction is. So there's hope. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. I really don't know. But there'll be some demand for that. You'll still have, I think, visibility on sites. And it may be when you have your bot will go and find that silk dress, they are going to go to Nordstrom and they'll find it, and it'll be plenty visible. You'll know who your seller is and whatever. There'll still be some visibility. I don't think the whole thing will be cloaked. But the more that it becomes opaque, the more difficult it's going to be to enforce policies and to see what's going on. And from a regulatory point of view, it's going to be the same kind of issue. The regulators can't see what's going on. They can suspect certain things are happening, and I suppose they can issue subpoenas or do some investigations or whatever it is. But unless they have some clear indication, it's probably a terrible use of resources to just send out random subpoenas because they're curious about a particular practice or whatever. We'll see. Again, this is evolving. It certainly will affect what we're doing one way or another. I mean, there's some other things too, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you also have some reaction taking place on the part of regulators where they don't like algorithmic pricing, for example. So you've had New York has passed a statute limiting its use for rental housing. California, just October 6th, passed a law that'll be effective in January that purports to control group use of algorithmic pricing. Some of the things, the law is, I still haven't reached a final conclusion on it, but the law is kind of scary because it seems to deal with some practices that historically have been legal. And moreover, by historically, I mean going back for 1,000 years. So I mean, think about this whole area. If you go way back, the essence of competition, which most governments think is a good thing, not all governments, but most think it's a pretty good thing. The essence of competition is making a decision in terms of whether you're going to lead, you're going to follow, or whether you're going to do nothing. So to make those kinds of decisions, you rely on information. And if you think about the stereotypical gas station on one corner and on the opposite corner is another gas station, well, one watches the other in terms of their pricing. And when one goes up by 5 cents a gallon, the other one likely will go up by 5 cents a gallon. That's perfectly lawful to watch what your competitors are doing. Now, there you see it firsthand. Obviously, as things become more complex, and you've got many resellers and you're a manufacturer and you want to see what's going on, you're going to rely on third parties to gather data for you. And that's not illegal either to gather data. It's not illegal for a manufacturer to go into a store and see what his or her products are being sold for. So what's going on is because of the tools are now much better, faster, cheaper in some cases, allowing you to gather all this kind of information and then process it. So we're really doing things in a sense that enhance competition, but there's a fear that it's going to lead to homogeneous pricing or other kinds of marketplace distortions. And I understand that. And I think the law is pretty capable of dealing with those kinds of things, but it's moving so fast and coming up with innovations that help people. Instead of looking out the window to see what their competitors doing, they now have other ways to gather the information and also see what's happening with their own products.
That's an interesting point that you make, that the way I interpret it is that a lot of these practices that may be driven through algorithms are actually things that were taking place in the real world or the analog world in the past. We're very familiar in retail with businesses that would send people into competitors' physical stores and take note of things happening in there and use that as competitive intelligence as just one example, like the gas stations. But now when you're doing that online with data gathering and you can set prices through algorithms, it's not that we so much haven't had dynamic pricing in the past. Price is relative. It's always adapting or trying to adapt as quickly as humans can make it adapt to changing factors in the environment. But now it can happen much more quickly with the algorithms, with the data, with the technology. And there's also the potential for perhaps relevant antitrust concerns with the information asymmetries at play. What are retailers and brands making those pricing decisions or pricing discrimination decisions based on? So there's some very valid concerns there. On that note, just leading a little further into dynamic pricing, we saw this, really blow up in the media a lot through the summer of 2024, and this goes on to this day. There's a lot at stake here with consumer perception, with brand trust. Are you able to speak to more of some of the legal and reputational risks for dynamic pricing as it relates specifically to consumer brands and retail?
Sure. I mean, the good news is, in a sense, from a legal perspective, price discrimination in the United States, in any event, is a business-to-business concern. Consumers don't have any cause of action to go after businesses and say, I paid more than she did or whatever. That just doesn't exist. There are other ways to get there, and I'll come to that in a minute. But from an antitrust point of view, that just doesn't exist. It's more at the business-to-business level. And if you think about it, the economists will say infinite amount of price discrimination will clear the market. So you start high. Well, some people are willing to buy at that price, and others at lower prices. I'm reminded of at various times when new cell phones are introduced. There are people who are early adopters, and they may be buying at the top of the market because they want to be the first in line. They stay up all night and they want to be first in line. They may be paying at the top of the market where 3 months later the price comes down. But they're willing to do that because they want to be first. And that's important that they have that kind of thing. In any event, I think that the bigger risk is not so much from a legal point of view. It is a reputational one, and it may have legal aspects. If it turns out whatever dynamic pricing you're using, it turns out that certain groups pay more. That is, suppose that however your pricing, whether it's an algorithm or whatever operated, let's say at the end of the day, it turns out that women pay more than men for the same product. That would be troublesome. From a reputational point of view, certainly, to say the least. There may be bigger issues too. There may be ethical issues and then that kind of thing. I think that what that means is that when you are using some of these very powerful tools, I think you have to stand back and say, what's really happening here? What is the result? If it turned out certain minority groups always paid more or whatever. I've read that while price discrimination is fairly common, it's tolerate it in particular with respect to senior citizens discounts. Very few people complain that senior citizens get save 10% or they get to do this or they get to do that. Like nobody cares. And people tend not to care about veterans discounts also, but they would care more if it turns out one pays more than another and they're, in a particular group. I mean, that having been said, it's also widely known that if you book the same flight that I do, and in fact sit next to me, depending on when you booked and how you booked and your status or whatever, you may be getting a much better price than I do.
Right.
And people seem to tolerate that too, or they're not aware of it. I mean, there may not be a lot of awareness in that regard. But, again, it's just an attempt to, among other things, fill up the plane. And what's it called? Yield management, I think, in the airline area. And it's the same thing hotels try to do and whatever, high fixed costs. And you try to fill up the hotel, you try to fill up the plane and things like that. People don't have to like it. And maybe they come to accept it. It doesn't seem like the airlines are under real scrutiny in that regard. I do know that the Federal Trade Commission has talked about surveillance pricing, that they're looking into it. They don't like it. And their term for surveillance pricing means essentially looking at consumer habits and then adjusting pricing accordingly, depending on what they're doing. And, by the way, I can't emphasize this enough. There may be people willing to pay more money for certain things, whether it's because they're early adopters, whether they want it now, or they want it way, or whatever it happens to be, where they know they're paying more, they don't care.
Right. I think that the analogy to airlines and yield management is really interesting because as consumers, we accept this, right? We're so used to variations in airline tickets, to a certain degree, concert tickets and things like that as well, experiences where supply is very fixed, but supply is also somewhat fixed as it relates to physical products. So in the grocery store, typically this is not an environment where we're used to dynamic price on prices changing, say on even a daily basis.
Right.
Yet we are accepting the experience of out of stocks or hoarding of product. I think about all the toilet paper that came off the shelves during the pandemic in certain countries, particularly in my country back home in Australia. And I think through the application of dynamic pricing in these contexts, again, it's just a more effective in that context, I think, market clearing mechanism, because you're either just going to have all the product fly off the shelves at the same price, or you can have better yield management through the manipulation of pricing. Supply and demand is the ultimate driver of outcomes. And I also think about the context of concert tickets. You could have a fixed price, but ultimately consumers will pay. They'll pay through their time of waiting in line or queues or, whatever the mechanism ends up being instead of price, usually time. So it's interesting. It's a real area of psychology, behavioral economics to observe what's happening in these different contexts, even though the tactics can be the same.
Again, some of this stuff is not new. It's my understanding, and this is anecdotal, but it seems to make sense. There's a electronics chain in the U.S. that historically had different prices at its different retail stores. And what they would do is a local market analysis. And in a market where there was a lot of competition, their prices would be lower. And there was a market where there wasn't much competition, the prices would be higher. And all other things being equal, I assume in some places the rents could be higher, or there could be more security personnel needed, or other kinds of things. But all the things being equal, they would just vary their price from store to store. Now, when you get online pricing, that's more difficult to do, and there tends to be a homogeneous price. Taking those kinds of things, looking at it from a store perspective, and adding other variables, we get down to the consumer level, much more granular. I think that's one of the things we're seeing, the ability to be much more granular. It's pretty powerful stuff. But again, I think what the concern is, why am I paying more money than the guy across the street? And it's just, why you're picking on me? There must be something wrong here. Well, maybe my buying habits are such. In another context, and I know I'm meandering a bit, but in another context, think about it. We often advise B2B sellers that, and this is a legitimate way to price differentiate from a legal point of view, to take a look at the buying patterns of their customers. So if they've got a customer in the B2B context that puts in a gazillion little orders as opposed to a few big orders, charging them more for that privilege because it's simply a higher cost of having to process those orders and whatever. It makes a lot of sense that they would pay more for putting in all the little bitty orders. And you're doing the same kind of thing with consumers. Well, how do they behave? What do they do? And I suppose there's some other things going on, putting on my marketing hat. Are some people just simply willing to pay more and that they don't look at the prices? So luxury goods, certain luxury goods are like that. The prices are obscene, in my mind anyway. But, more power to them. People are willing to pay for it, and it is what it is. I think there's a lot more, and that's the other thing that gets distorted, particularly from a government point of view. To them, handbag is a handbag is a handbag in many respects. Well, yeah, it kind of is. They may have the same function, but some people are willing to pay more for that logo on there or a particular design or whatever it happens to be. And they get some kind of psychic reward for that goes beyond just the functionality of a handbag.
Right. And in the context of luxury brands, a lot of that additional margin is then relayed back into the marketing and communications and storytelling that creates that, image or perception that is capturing the attention of that person. So it's interesting.
And some brands too are intentionally high touch brands with a lot of personal service and whatever it happens to be. And that's important. That's what drives them. And that high touch costs more.
Exactly. So shifting on to the next question I have, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this. Where do you see bold opportunities and bold risks as AI becomes further embedded into pricing strategy, but also global supply chains more broadly?
Well, I think that while there'll be changes, still the fundamentals aren't going to be radically different. I think what AI will allow is more data and the processing of more data. I think that, and there's certainly been plenty written about this, it's not the kind of thing where you can just let it run loose and make all the decisions for you. I think somebody with a brain needs to stand back and say, what's really going on here? Does this make sense? And doesn't it? Particularly when there are certain considerations that go beyond just the numbers or AI learning and whatever. So somebody needs to do that. It's just like in general, whether it be big data or other kinds of things. We have a lot more information sources. We've got a lot more going on, and it certainly makes it more difficult for managers sometimes in decision making because they simply have too much data. So the idea of refining it to what do I need? What can I handle? What can I process? I think that's going to be even more important as time goes on. By the same token, again, not just putting it on automatic pilot and letting AI make all the decisions either. Somebody has to stand back and say, does this make sense? Doesn't it? AI probably can't take into account reputational risk, for example, if things go really bad. I mean, think about, and I suspect it wasn't AI driven, but look at some of the branding mistakes that have been made by Bud Light, Target, Cracker Barrel, all those things. The lesson seems to come out is be true to your core. And when you start ignoring your core, you wind up in big trouble. That's not to say you shouldn't expand into other markets or look at other opportunities or whatever. But I think in all those cases, those brands kind of turned their back on their core and they really paid for it big time. Well, will AI pick that up? Or maybe if it's included as a consideration, I don't know. But somebody has to think about that kind of stuff and stand back. So I think the idea of being bold and moving into new areas, using AI as a tool, but it's only a tool. It's not going to replace decision makers. And maybe at a very, very low level, but not the people who make all the big decisions.
Absolutely. I think it's an enabling infrastructure, and it condenses the time it takes to make decisions, to execute, to compute, really. But as you say, it's really the orientation and the context that is going to always require human oversight and for humans to be one step ahead. And I think this really calls upon us to heighten our skills in empathy, in seeing the big picture, in understanding and orienting, because also a lot of the biases that we have as humans have been internalized into these systems. And when you do look at them at work, you can actually notice certain things and say, oh, no, that's really not going to work in that context. But again, the machine is the tool. It's just doing what it's been taught to do. So the human lens is not going anywhere. in my opinion.
I think it's going to be harder in a way, though, because there'll simply be more information. And I think there'll be a temptation to rely more on automatic pilot to avoid some kinds of things. If you think about it, even as people develop models that take a whole bunch of data and keep refining it until a few things that we humans can actually understand and decide what we're going to do. In the process of doing that, certain things are undoubtedly lost in making generalizations and whatever. You can't look at everything individually. So you need some generalizations about what are you doing? What kind of assumptions underlie what we're doing? And I think that's important, is to understand the assumptions. That's kind of like all of us see news reports all the time when they report, this particular indicator has gone up by 26% or has gone up by 5%. Let's take a smaller number. But, they never say things like, is that statistically significant? They never get into that. Or is that just a normal variation? Or what are they comparing, apples and oranges? What's really going on here? I think that's necessary to really question what you're getting. And again, my concern is that because of all the data, people are going to take shortcuts because we're humans. We generalize. That's the only way we can manage all this. And you have to keep your eye on the ball of what really underlies this, what decisions are being made, what assumptions are being used. Does this really make sense at the end of the day? What's really going on? And so I think it's going to be harder as there's more data. And again, the temptation to just kind of go on automatic pilot.
Yeah, absolutely. The call for us to lean into our critical thinking skills at all levels is pertinent, and to never neglect that in the face of using these tools and machines.
Yeah, that's what I would think. And this is me off the top of my head, but I would think that if I'm investing in some of these tools, I want to understand how they work, and I want to understand the underlying assumptions and what they're based on, so that I can take them into account in my own decision making. So when they report an answer to me, what's that really based on? What did they do? What were they assuming is the case? What did they take into account? And I don't know if the providers of these kinds of things are very good at talking about the premises upon which they're based, or they just say, hey, this will solve all your problems. Just go down this path.
Yeah, the silver bullet we all know doesn't exist. And I think that's also the concern that, a lot of these tools, as they ingest more data and they take on more decision making for themselves and computational power, they do become somewhat like black boxes. And so maybe you won't actually know exactly what they are basing their decisions on. However, I think in that context, to have a vision and a sense of orientation of where you do need to go is important, because even if you don't know perhaps how they're giving that recommendation, you can know that something is still off or at fault, and that you as the person, the human, you need to come in and bridge that gap. I do want to ask you, Eugene, if you were in the boardroom with a Fortune 500 brand or retail team today, if there was 3 things you could tell them that they could do immediately to mitigate risks while still pursuing pricing innovation, what would those 3 things be?
Well, I think the first thing, and I run into this a surprisingly amount of the time, and that is figuring out what you want, your objectives. There are lots of businesses where they don't know what they want. It's very floaty. Yeah, we want to make more money or whatever. But they don't have really objectives that they can tether their strategies to and everything else. It's kind of go with the flow sort of thing. But a lot of people don't understand what do they want. And I think that's where you start out with. In fact, I often tell clients, don't worry about the law. Give me a wish list. Tell me what you want in the ideal world. And then I'll work within that and get you as close to it as we can within the risks that you're willing to endure. Anyway, I think the first thing is understanding what you want. The second thing is committing to it. Again, I see a lot of companies, their commitment, it's like runs hot and cold, or there is no commitment. And by commitment, it often means at the highest level within the company. At the highest level, they don't have to know all the details, but they have to say, yes, this is what we want. This is what we're willing to do. And I think the third thing is to be holistic in terms of looking at problems and solutions. To give you a perfect example, as I mentioned earlier, I do a lot of pricing policies where I set minimum offer prices or resale prices. And in some organizations, people that push back really hard on doing that are the salespeople. And why? Because salespeople are often compensated based on volume, not on profit. So if we're setting up a pricing policy where there are certain penalties, such as resellers who don't comply get cut off, or they have other kinds of negative things happen. That may cut down on the amount that they buy, obviously, and that's going to affect the paycheck for the salesperson. So of course the
Right.
salesperson is adverse to it. But what that means is, when I'm called in to work on pulling together one of these policies or whatever, and again, there may be a variety of reasons for doing it, pointing out that, look, I'm not responsible, I'm not an HR person, I'm not responsible for your Salesforce compensation model. But one thing to think about is, are you incentivizing behavior that is inconsistent with your other goals by, say, focusing on volume or things like that? It's the same thing with looking at a company's discount structure as part of a revenue growth management program or whatever, but looking at their discount structure, are you your own worst enemy? Are you incentivizing behaviors that throw off your other objectives? You're rewarding resellers for doing certain things that are inconsistent with your other objectives. Now maybe it's a balance. Maybe you got to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that's okay if you do it consciously, but a lot of this stuff's sort of legacy built in. And you realize you're shooting yourself in the foot every day. So anyway, that's the third thing I think about. It's holistic. Look at what's really going on here and what it affects. It's kind of like the pebble in the pond kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you get all the ripple effect. And yes, we'll address this problem, but what else is it going to do in other areas?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That was actually leading into my next question. I wanted to ask you about mindset shifts for leaders. And I think that the incentives one is really important, particularly in enterprise, where you can find yourself in a position you're inheriting a legacy structure, you're inheriting lots of different processes, whether related to compensation or how something is sold or moved through the supply chain. And what you set as that vision or those goals can be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve if the incentives aren't aligned. And sometimes that requires looking at the whole structure and reorganizing the different parts. And I don't think that a lot of traditional maybe approaches to education, and I haven't done an MBA myself, so I can't speak to that, but they're not necessarily looking at things at that very high level. Are there any other mindset shifts that you would touch on as it relates to this area?
Off the top of my head, I guess if you take a look at everything, to the extent you can, I think being nimble as you're allowed to be anyway, because there are certain structures. None of us can do everything that we want to do. Being able to move fast, and as fast as you can to take advantage of opportunities, thinking about the holistic effects. I guess it's something else too that I've used to my advantage over the years. I've worked with various companies. Most companies believe that they're the only ones in this particular position and that nobody else is facing the same stuff. And, maybe they'll go a little farther and say, well, other companies in our industry have the same issues. But I'm talking about thinking more broadly and saying, yeah, okay, you're in the automotive aftermarket business, but you realize that your business is very much like clothing. Say, what? What are you talking about, clothing? Well, in the automotive aftermarket business, you have what's called fitments. That is, that there are lots of different colors, sizes, styles to fit various vehicles. And so if you're a manufacturer of brake pads or something, you've got to keep all that in mind because you've got a bunch of fitments that you have to deal with, and your SKU number is usually huge. What's the same thing in clothing? Clothing, you've got color, size, style. And so you've got multiple versions of everything that you make. And it's the same kind of thing. Well, how do you manage things in a high SKU environment? Well, surprisingly, those two industries are alike in that regard, yet they seem very, very different, but they're not. And I think taking learnings from certain areas that seem disparate and applying them to others, it can be very, very useful. But there's a tendency to think more narrowly that there's no business like ours. This is the only thing we do. Well, that's not true.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You've just given me some inspiration for some intelligence node case studies there. Automotive parts and the fashion as well.
But it is, and it's surprising. Because when you say that, people say you're crazy. I mean, we make greasy automotive things. This is fashion, hardly greasy, or whatever. But yeah, they're very similar.
Yeah, it's the dynamic. Yeah,
in that respect. I mean, obviously they're very different in others. It's great stuff. And being able to take those insights. That's why I think some of the best discussions I've ever been in is when you get decision makers in a room and they're from different industries. But you talk about problems and you get input. Somebody saying, oh, we tried that. It didn't work for us. even though, again, they're in a very different industry worldwide. Was it because of an industry difference or personalities or, what's really going on here? But learning sort of cross-pollination, I think, is very
Yes.
valuable. And I think that's one of the reasons some of the best consultants are those that have this many industry perspectives that they can bring to the table. Yes, they may know agricultural products inside and out because that's what they do, but they've also worked in a variety of other industries, and they can bring various things to bear. Things that seem very dissimilar, and yet they're not.
Right, right. And it's really getting at the nature of the problem and the decision making and how the parts are moving underneath the surface. So I think that cross domain, cross pollination, cross industry, across everything I say now, because that's sort of the level at which we have to learn. I want to ask you, Eugene, 1 year from now, how do you see the pricing risk landscape evolving, especially as regulators try to catch up to AI and global supply chain complexity? Is there anything that you see that you'd like to mention specifically unfolding in the next 12 months?
Well, I mentioned this California statute, for example, that seems overreaching in that it could, and we'll see it. It's one of these things where there's a certain amount of vagueness in the statute. And, how do you fill in the blanks when something is vague? Litigation. There'll be a lot of lawsuits. They're going to interpret what this really means and what's really going on and so on and so forth. So I think a year is probably too short because I think even though things are moving fast, it's going to take a long time to fill in the blanks. And one of my concerns is that regulators who like to regulate, they're trying to meet a perceived need. Algorithmic pricing is bad, therefore we need to outlaw it. Well, is it really? And when is it bad? When does it step over the line? And I'm not so sure they're being very discriminating in terms of where they're drawing those lines. And eventually, it's going to be up to the courts. And even then, the courts may move things in different directions. So I think the pace of innovation will continue. I think AI is the current shiny object that's attracting a lot of people. I think there'll be maybe not in a year, but I think there'll be a consolidation and a fall off. A lot of people doing AI won't be doing it 5 years from now, meaning the providers, because I think there'll be a consolidation.
Yes, for sure.
I think people will learn more about where it works and where it doesn't and where it's useful and where it isn't. But I don't see these things as overnight changes. I see as gradually. And as I said, I'm worried a bit about overregulation kind of screwing things up. But maybe the courts will resolve that, or maybe the light bulb's going to go off over a period of time. This goes back to what we talked about earlier. I think the idea of keeping an eye on what's going on, applying critical thinking to what's happening, adopting those things that seem to make sense, maintain flexibility, don't turn everything over all at once. Consider an exit strategy. What happens if it doesn't work? How do we get out of this? How do we do it the right way? Sometimes companies make sudden jerky moves and they usually regret them. This is more evolutionary, I think. Yes, you need to stay up to date. Yes, you need to keep an eye on the ball, but what's really right for what you want to accomplish, what you're committed to do, and part of that too is your risk tolerance. When I talk about risk, I don't mean only legal risk. I mean, I'm a lawyer. That's what we're supposed to talk about. But I think a far more powerful consideration in a lot of cases are trade relations risk, getting people upset, your customers and your intermediaries and things like that. And then plain old business risk. But business risk is something I think most business people are most familiar with. That is making a decision that turns out to be a wrong one, that things just don't work out. Now, hopefully it's not bet the company kind of thing and you can react and move away from it or whatever. So this business risk, very common, very used to doing that. Trade relations risk, often the most important considerations up and down the line. And then finally, legal risk. And they're all important, but I think of them, trade relations risk, which include reputational risk, is probably the most important of the three.
Absolutely. Yeah, that one can be hard, if not impossible, to recover from relative to just the business risk. In light of some of the things you've mentioned, from your perspective, and this is our last question, what would you say that best practice pricing governance could look like, especially in relation to balancing consumer trust, compliance, and profitability?
Well, I think maybe you put your finger on it. It is a balance. where you have to take a bunch of considerations into account. And, you mentioned earlier about ethics. For some years now, I've written the legal chapter in a widely used pricing book. I'm the only outside author. And I remember talking to the principal author, whose name is Tom Nagel, by the way. And Tom wanted me to write a chapter about ethics. And I said, Tom, I'm a lawyer. We're not concerned about ethics. And he laughed. And what I mean about that is, yes, we have legal ethics that to worry about, and so on, and ethical considerations in pricing are certainly important too. But as lawyers, it's not our job to say that's bad for ethical reasons. My job is to say, what are the risks associated with various options and how to construct things in a certain way that give you the kind of flexibility that's consistent with your risk tolerance. Whether it's good or bad to charge a price at this level because it's so high, that's not my decision. It's a business decision. It's not within the ambit of what I do. Now, I can point out that there may be some reputational risks or things like that attached to it, but it's not my job to make those decisions. It's not my job to say you can't do something. My job, again, is to say these are the risks. You decide, business person, what you're most comfortable in doing. I think that's the best sort of practice. But it's a balance. You got to balance all these things going on in terms of, what opportunities do we take? Which ones do we give up? How do we want to behave? Not only from a legal perspective, which, yes, is a consideration, but from a trade relations point of view, from a business risk point of view. How do we want to behave? How do we want to be seen? What's our image? What do we do? Some people will just say, look, we don't necessarily want to be the biggest, or we don't have to have fancy headquarters or whatever, or any of that kind of stuff. We just want to be a good sort of number two in this particular position. In fact, it reminds me of a war story. A consultant told me once they were working with a manufacturer of electrical products sold through electrical distributors. And there are maybe 3 or 4 really big brands. And these people were a good second brand. So their products were good and everything else, but they didn't have the panache of the really big brands. Cool. And they knew that they wouldn't displace them. So the strategy they came up with in going to distributors was, look, distributor, we know you got to carry 1 or 2 of the big brands. And we know that for your own reasons, you want to carry a secondary brand like ours. But look what you're doing. You've got 8 different secondary brands. Make us your lead second and get rid of some of those other brands, kind of rationalize your assortment. And it turned out to be extraordinarily successful. And we see it at another level too. I mean, think about it. You go to the grocery store, and it used to be at one point that there would be 8 different brands of canned green beans on the shelf. There'd be a couple of the big brands. There might be a private label for the store, and then there'd be a bunch of secondary brands. And some years ago, a lot of really smart retailers just said, we don't need 8 brands of green beans. We're going to carry 1 or 2 of the top ones in our private label, and that's about it. We don't need this other stuff. And that frees up more shelf space for other kinds of things. It's the same kind of decision making.
Yeah, so it's really the mission, knowing what you want to achieve, the orientation and understanding the trade-offs. But then I think one thing that's come up repeatedly is not just the business risk, but the trade relations risk too. Super important. Gene, I know we've had a really long conversation. I really appreciate the insight that you've shared. I'm sure many of our brand and retail listeners might be interested in learning more and getting in touch for some more specialized advice. So we will absolutely follow up with your details if anybody reaches out. And I think you've really shown us, that pricing is not just a math problem. It's not just a legal problem. It's really a reputational and strategic risk and lever in this world where regulation is lagging innovation, emphasizing the need to build contract systems and strategies that balance profitability, that balance trust is super important. And I just want to say thank you for your time. We look forward to further conversations, and a little plug for my former employer, Eversight, who connected us thinking back to our days at Revenue Roundup. So some wonderful memories there with some leaders across the industry. So thank you so much, Gene.
And thank you very much. You're a wonderful hostess, and you got me thinking, which is a good thing.
That's great. That's excellent. Well, thank you.